The morning of September 13th, 1942, on a ridgeline south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson stood in a foxhole that smelled of wet earth and cordite, looking at the jungle tree line 400 yards downslope. His uniform was stained dark with sweat despite the pre-dawn cold. Around him, 840 men of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion occupied a series of hastily dug positions along a coral and kunai grass ridge that would, by the next evening, have a different name. They had been on Guadalcanal for 37 days. In that time, they had conducted multiple raids behind Japanese lines, ambushed enemy patrols, and now found themselves holding what everyone understood was the critical terrain between the Japanese forces massing in the jungle and the only operational airfield the Americans possessed in the Solomon Islands. The raiders were exhausted. Their dungarees hung loose on frames that had shed 15 to 20 pounds per man. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery had reduced some companies to half strength. They subsisted on 2 meals per day of captured Japanese rice, supplemented with whatever sea rations could be brought forward. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing captured documents and interrogating prisoners taken in earlier skirmishes, had compiled assessments of these Marine raiders. The reports, translated after the war from Imperial Japanese Army documents, described the raiders as undisciplined shock troops, lacking the cohesion and staying power of regular infantry formations. One intelligence summary noted that while the raiders showed aggressive tendencies in small unit actions, they were considered unsuitable for sustained defensive operations. The assessment concluded they would break under determined attack by properly trained Imperial forces. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This assessment was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had landed on Guadalcanal with approximately 3,000 men of the 35th Infantry Brigade. His mission was explicit: destroy Henderson Field, eliminate American forces on the island, and restore Japanese control of Guadalcanal. His plan called for a coordinated 3-pronged assault. The main effort would come from the south, directly at the ridge Edson's men now occupied. Kawaguchi's forces had been moving through the jungle for days, cutting their way through vegetation so thick that progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day rather than miles. They carried their ammunition, their weapons, and minimal rations through terrain that had no trails, no roads, nothing but endless green darkness punctuated by rain. But they were Japanese infantry, trained to endure hardship that would break lesser soldiers. They had fought in China. They had conquered Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. They did not question whether they would succeed. They questioned only how quickly success would come. The raiders waiting on that ridge represented something the Japanese High Command had not encountered before in this war. They were volunteers, selected through a process that emphasized individual capability and mental toughness over traditional military conformity. They had been trained in methods that regular Marine infantry considered unorthodox, even reckless. Their doctrine emphasized night operations, small unit tactics, and a kind of controlled aggression that made conventional commanders uncomfortable. The Japanese assessment of these men as undisciplined was understandable from a certain perspective. Raiders did not march with the parade ground precision of regular infantry. They did not maintain the rigid hierarchies that characterized both Japanese and conventional American military culture. They improvised, adapted, and broke rules that other units considered sacred. To observers trained in traditional military culture, this looked like a lack of discipline. That assessment confused means with ends, style with substance. Over the next 4 months, that confusion would cost the Japanese thousands of lives, and ultimately, Guadalcanal itself. The Marine raiders were born from a conversation between President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the spring of 1942. Roosevelt had been impressed by accounts of British commandos conducting raids along the occupied European coast. He asked the Marine Corps to create similar units, forces that could strike Japanese-held islands, gather intelligence, and tie down enemy troops through aggressive action. The Marine Corps leadership had mixed feelings about this directive. They argued that every Marine was already trained for aggressive amphibious operations, that creating elite units within an elite force was redundant and potentially divisive. But presidential directives carry weight that transcends institutional preferences. In February 1942, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion was activated at Quantico, Virginia, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. Edson was 44 years old, ancient by infantry standards. He had served in Nicaragua in the 1920s and early 30s, leading patrols through jungle terrain against guerrilla forces. He understood small unit tactics, night operations, and the psychological dimensions of irregular warfare. He was also a strict disciplinarian who believed that true discipline came not from rigid adherence to arbitrary rules, but from internalized standards of performance and mutual trust between leaders and subordinates. The selection process for raiders was rigorous. Volunteers underwent physical testing that exceeded standard Marine requirements. They marched 25 miles with full combat load. They swam in full uniform. They completed obstacle courses designed to identify men who would continue moving forward when exhausted, in pain, and confronted with apparent impossibility. Perhaps more importantly, they were evaluated for mental characteristics: initiative, adaptability, the capacity to function independently when separated from higher command. Training emphasized skills that regular infantry covered minimally or not at all. Raiders spent weeks learning demolitions, not just how to emplace charges, but how to improvise explosives from available materials. They practiced small boat operations, learning to navigate rubber rafts through surf and land silently on hostile shores. They trained extensively in knife fighting and hand-to-hand combat, close-quarters skills that would prove essential in jungle warfare, where visibility was measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards. They learned to navigate without maps, using terrain, features, the sun, and dead reckoning to find their way through unfamiliar country. They practiced living off the land, identifying edible plants and water sources, moving through wilderness without leaving obvious trails. They conducted night marches and night attacks until moving in darkness became natural rather than terrifying. By the time the 1st Raider Battalion completed training in May 1942, they were the most comprehensively prepared infantry unit in the American military for the kind of warfare they would face in the Pacific. Japanese infantry training followed completely different principles, rooted in different assumptions about warfare and the nature of discipline. The Imperial Japanese Army emphasized absolute obedience to orders, endurance of physical hardship as a spiritual exercise, and the subordination of individual survival to unit objectives. Japanese infantry trained to attack with bayonets, closing with the enemy regardless of casualties. They trained to hold defensive positions until death rather than withdrawal. They trained to view surrender as dishonor worse than death itself. This training produced soldiers of remarkable physical toughness and moral courage. Japanese infantry could march farther, carry more weight, and endure worse conditions than almost any contemporary force. They would attack positions that other armies would consider impregnable. They would continue fighting when surrounded, outnumbered, and out of supplies. These were genuine strengths, capabilities that had won Japan stunning victories across Asia and the Pacific in the first months of the war. Japanese military intelligence operated under certain assumptions about American fighting qualities, assumptions derived from cultural analysis, observation of American society, and early combat experience. These assumptions were not arbitrary prejudices. They were analytical conclusions drawn from available evidence, interpreted through the lens of Japanese military culture. American society was understood to be individualistic, materialistic, and soft. Americans were seen as people who valued comfort and personal safety over collective obligation. This was not entirely wrong as observation. American forces did demand better living conditions than their Japanese counterparts. American soldiers did expect regular mail from home, hot meals when possible, and medical evacuation when wounded. They did not endure hardship silently as a matter of cultural expectation. Japanese analysts concluded that these characteristics would manifest as military weakness. American units would lack cohesion because their soldiers thought of themselves as individuals rather than cells in a larger organism. They would break under sustained pressure because they had not been conditioned to accept death as a natural outcome of military service. They would retreat rather than fight to annihilation because their culture had not instilled the warrior ethos that made death preferable to defeat. The Marine raiders seem to confirm certain aspects of this analysis, while contradicting others. Reports from early encounters noted that raiders operated in small, dispersed units rather than massed formations. They broke contact when outnumbered rather than fighting to predetermined conclusions. They emphasized stealth and surprise over direct confrontation. These behaviors looked like lack of discipline to observers trained in conventional Japanese tactics. What Japanese intelligence failed to recognize was that these were conscious doctrinal choices, not manifestations of weak moral fiber. The raiders operated in small units because small units are harder to detect and can move through restrictive terrain more easily than large formations. They broke contact when outnumbered because preserving force for future operations was more important than winning individual tactical engagements. They emphasized stealth because achieving objectives without fighting was more efficient than achieving them through direct assault. Japanese assessments also failed to account for differences between tactical flexibility and strategic dissolution. A unit that adapts its methods to changing circumstances is exercising intelligent discipline. A unit that maintains rigid adherence to predetermined plans, regardless of changing conditions, is exercising a different kind of discipline, one that can be admirable but also catastrophically inflexible. The cultural gap in understanding discipline was profound. Japanese military culture defined discipline as conformity to hierarchical authority and willing acceptance of orders regardless of personal consequences. American military culture, particularly as embodied by the raiders, defined discipline as the internalized capacity to perform difficult tasks without external enforcement. Both definitions produced effective soldiers under certain conditions. The question facing both forces on Guadalcanal was which definition would prove more durable under sustained combat stress. By early September 1942, both systems were about to face testing that would resolve theoretical debates through the absolute empiricism of combat. The Japanese were preparing to attack with forces they considered sufficient to overwhelm what they understood as undisciplined American shock troops. The Marines were preparing to defend terrain they understood as essential to holding Guadalcanal. Neither side fully understood what the other was capable of sustaining. Over the next 72 hours, both would learn. The raiders on Edson's Ridge had specific equipment and specific limitations, both of which would define what happened next. Each man carried an M1903 Springfield rifle or an M1 Garand, the newer semi-automatic weapon that was gradually replacing the bolt-action Springfield throughout the Marine Corps. Raiders preferred the Springfield for its accuracy and reliability, though the Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic action provided firepower advantages in close combat. Ammunition supply was critical and constrained. Each rifleman carried 80 rounds in his cartridge belt and bandoliers, plus whatever additional ammunition he could stuff into pockets. Machine gun crews had the Browning M1917A1 water-cooled 30-caliber machine gun, a weapon that could sustain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition lasted. The problem was getting ammunition forward. Supply lines on Guadalcanal were tenuous at best. Everything came ashore at Lunga Point, then had to be hand-carried or moved by the few available trucks over roads that were barely improved trails. The ridge itself offered minimal defensive advantages beyond elevation and fields of fire. There were no prepared positions, no fortifications, nothing but hastily dug foxholes connected by shallow communication trenches. The coral substrate made digging difficult. Men scraped out depressions using entrenching tools, then reinforced them with logs cut from the kunai grass and whatever sandbags could be filled with the thin tropical soil. Food was a constant problem. The official ration was 2 meals per day, but actual distribution was irregular. Sea rations, when available, provided canned meat, crackers, and powdered coffee or lemonade. Captured Japanese rice supplemented American supplies, though eating enemy rations created its own psychological dimension. Some men refused to eat Japanese food on principle. Others ate whatever was available and stayed functional. Water came from the Lunga River, and had to be treated with halazone tablets that left it tasting of chlorine and chemicals. Men learned to drink it anyway. Dehydration in the tropical heat was more dangerous than the intestinal parasites the tablets were meant to kill. Medical supplies were limited to what battalion aid stations could maintain: plasma for treating shock, morphine for pain, sulfur drugs for infection, bandages and surgical tools for the corpsmen who would crawl forward under fire to treat wounded men where they fell. The Japanese forces moving toward the ridge had their own material reality, equally constraining but differently manifested. Kawaguchi's men carried the Type 38 Arisaka rifle, a bolt-action weapon firing a 6.5mm cartridge. The rifle was accurate and reliable, though its smaller caliber meant less stopping power than the American 30-aught 6-round. Each soldier carried 120 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips, plus grenades and personal equipment. Japanese infantry traveled light by necessity and doctrine. Each man carried his weapon, ammunition, a blanket, minimal personal items, and 5 days of rations. The rations were rice, canned meat or fish, hardtack, and occasionally pickled plums called umeboshi. Total combat load was approximately 40 to 50 pounds, compared to 60 to 70 pounds for American infantry. This lighter load allowed Japanese troops to move faster through jungle terrain, though it meant they were dependent on shorter supply lines and had less staying power in extended operations. Kawaguchi's force had cut its way through the jungle south of Henderson Field, carrying everything they needed for the assault. They had Type 92 heavy machine guns, which required 4-man crews to transport the gun, tripod, and ammunition. They had grenade dischargers, light mortars that could fire small explosive shells in high arcs over vegetation and terrain obstacles. They had explosives for demolishing obstacles and limited artillery support from guns that had been manhandled into positions covering likely avenues of attack. What they did not have was adequate intelligence about the terrain they would be attacking across or the dispositions of the forces defending it. Japanese reconnaissance had been limited by American air superiority from Henderson Field and by the difficulty of moving through the jungle without being detected. Kawaguchi knew approximately where the American positions were, but he did not know their depth, their strength, or how they were organized. Both forces approached the coming battle with incomplete information and constrained resources. The Japanese assumed they were attacking positions held by disorganized American forces who would collapse under determined assault. The Marines knew they were defending critical terrain against an enemy who had demonstrated willingness to attack regardless of casualties. Neither side understood how the next 72 hours would fundamentally reshape their understanding of what the other was capable of sustaining. The evening of September 12, 1942, Japanese forces began their approach march, moving through the jungle in columns that stretched back thousands of yards. They moved quietly, with discipline born from years of training. Scouts led each column, followed by riflemen, then machine gun crews, and mortar teams. Officers moved with their units, swords at their sides, prepared to lead from the front when the assault began. The first Japanese probe came at 2,100 hours, on September 12th. Small groups of soldiers emerged from the jungle below the ridge, testing the American positions, trying to identify strong points and gaps in the line. Marine sentries held fire until the Japanese were within 100 yards, then opened up with rifles and machine guns. The probe withdrew after 20 minutes of scattered fighting. Edson understood what was happening. This was reconnaissance by fire, probing attacks designed to map the defensive positions before the main assault. He moved along the line, checking positions, talking to his company commanders, ensuring ammunition was distributed, and everyone understood the plan. The plan was simple: hold the ridge. If positions became untenable, withdraw to successive defensive lines, rather than being overrun, but hold the ridge. At midnight, the real attack began. Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle in organized waves, moving upslope toward the Marine positions. They came shouting, some screaming, "Marine, you die!" in English, others simply yelling battle cries meant to intimidate and overwhelm. They fired as they advanced, muzzle flashes creating a moving line of light across the dark hillside. Marine riflemen engaged targets as they appeared. The Springfield and Garand rifles fired methodically, aimed shots at visible targets. Machine guns traversed across the advancing lines, firing in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. The water-cooled Brownings maintained a steady rhythm, the sound distinct from the sharper crack of rifles, a mechanical hammering that spoke of industrial capacity translated into suppressive fire. The Japanese reached to within 50 yards of some positions before the intensity of fire forced them to ground. They took cover behind rocks, fallen, logs, slight folds in the terrain. They returned fire, trying to suppress the Marine positions. Grenade dischargers lobbed small explosives into the American lines. Men were hit, screamed, or died silently depending on where they were struck and how their nervous systems processed catastrophic trauma. The first assault lasted 40 minutes before the Japanese withdrew to regroup. Marine casualties were light, a few wounded, no positions overrun, but ammunition expenditure had been heavy. Machine gun crews counted remaining belts. Riflemen redistributed cartridges from the dead and wounded to men still in fighting positions. Corpsmen moved through the positions, treating wounds by flashlight, shielded by ponchos to prevent giving away positions. The second assault came at 0200 hours. This time, the Japanese concentrated on a narrow section of the line, attempting to achieve breakthrough through mass rather than dispersed pressure. They came in larger numbers, moving faster, accepting casualties to close with the American positions. Some reached the Marine foxholes. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in several locations, men grappling with bayonets, knives, entrenching tools, anything that could kill at arm's length. A Marine corporal named Walter Burak found himself fighting a Japanese soldier in his foxhole. The Japanese man had jumped in with his bayonet extended. Burak blocked the thrust with his rifle, then drove the butt of his weapon into the soldier's face. The man went down. Burak shot him twice with his M1911 pistol, then climbed out of the foxhole because it now contained a body, and he couldn't fight effectively, sharing that confined space with a corpse. Lieutenant Colonel Edson was everywhere the line threatened to break, moving between positions under fire, directing reinforcements, ordering withdrawals when positions became untenable, personally carrying ammunition forward when runners were killed or wounded. He maintained radio communication with division headquarters, requesting artillery support, updating situation reports, ensuring that everyone understood the raiders were still holding even as they gave ground. The third assault came just before dawn. The Japanese committed everything they had left after 2 failed attacks, throwing themselves at the Marine positions in waves that absorbed casualties and kept coming. They were shouting, screaming, some were singing military songs. They believed they were winning, that one more push would break through, that the Americans were on the verge of collapse. The Marines were exhausted. They had been fighting for 6 hours. They were running low on ammunition. They had casualties they couldn't evacuate because moving in the dark meant exposing yourself to fire from both sides. Some positions had been overrun and retaken twice. Some foxholes contained multiple dead from both sides, men who had killed each other in close combat and fallen together. But they did not break. The line contracted, pulling back from untenable forward positions to successive defensive lines Edson had prepared. But it did not disintegrate. It remained coherent, organized, capable of delivering coordinated fire. Machine guns that had fired thousands of rounds were still functioning. Riflemen who had expended their basic load were firing ammunition taken from casualties and resupply brought forward by runners. The defensive line held. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dawn on September 13th brought a lull in fighting but no respite. Japanese dead lay scattered across the slopes below the ridge, some within yards of Marine positions. The raiders counted their own casualties, 27 dead, nearly 100 wounded. These were significant losses for a battalion that had started the night with 840 effectives, but the unit remained functional, still holding the critical terrain. Edson reorganized his positions during daylight hours. He contracted the defensive line, pulling back to a tighter perimeter that was easier to defend and required fewer troops to hold. He redistributed ammunition, ensured casualties were evacuated to aid stations, and personally inspected positions to identify weaknesses that needed reinforcement before night fell again. Japanese forces also spent the daylight hours regrouping. Kawaguchi brought forward additional troops, consolidated his scattered units, and planned the next assault. He had lost hundreds of men in the night attacks, but remained confident that sustained pressure would break the American defense. His intelligence had indicated these were undisciplined troops, unsuitable for extended combat. The previous night's fighting had cost the Americans heavily. One more night of attacks would finish them. The second night's assault began earlier, at 1,830 hours, while some daylight remained. Japanese forces approached through the jungle and across open ground, attempting to use the fading light to close distance before Marine riflemen could engage effectively. The Marines held fire until the Japanese were committed to their assault routes, then opened up with every weapon they had. Artillery support from American guns positioned near Henderson Field dropped shells into the jungle where Japanese forces were forming up. The explosions created chaos in the rear areas, disrupting command and control, killing and wounding men before they could even reach the assault positions. Japanese officers struggled to maintain unit cohesion as troops spread out to avoid the artillery impact zones. The main assault came after full darkness, wave after wave of Japanese infantry advancing upslope under covering fire from machine guns and grenade dischargers. They had learned from the previous night's failures. They moved in smaller groups, using terrain and vegetation for cover, concentrating attacks on specific points, rather than assaulting along the entire line simultaneously. Marine positions were hit repeatedly, sometimes from multiple directions, as Japanese forces infiltrated around the flanks. Fighting was confused, desperate, conducted at ranges where men could hear each other breathing. Grenades were thrown back and forth. Machine guns fired until barrels glowed red. Riflemen worked their bolts or changed magazines mechanically, muscle memory overriding exhaustion and fear. A Marine private named Robert Leckie, who would later write extensively about his Guadalcanal experience, found himself fighting in darkness so complete he couldn't see his own hands. He fired at muzzle flashes, at sounds of movement, at shadows that might have been Japanese soldiers or might have been jungle vegetation moving in the wind. He had no idea whether his shots hit anything. He knew only that he kept firing because stopping meant dying. The Japanese kept coming with a persistence that seemed inhuman to the exhausted Marines. They attacked positions that had already repulsed multiple assaults. They climbed over their own dead to reach American foxholes. They fought with a determination that rejected any possibility of withdrawal or surrender. Some carried flags that they attempted to plant on captured positions, symbols of victory that would prove they had taken the ridge. But they did not take the ridge. Every breakthrough was contained, every penetration sealed by Marines who moved to threatened positions and fought until the Japanese were pushed back or killed. The defensive line bent but did not break. Communications remained functional. Leadership remained coherent. The raiders fought as an organized unit, not as a collection of individuals trying to survive. By dawn on September 14th, the second night of fighting was over. The Japanese had committed everything they had and achieved nothing except additional casualties. Kawaguchi's forces withdrew into the jungle, exhausted, depleted, no longer capable of offensive operations. The Marines held the ridge. They had held it for 2 nights against an enemy who was supposed to break them through sustained assault. They had not broken. The ridge that Edson's raiders held through those 2 nights received a new name. Marines who fought there began calling it Edson's Ridge, later formalized as Bloody Ridge in recognition of the cost paid by both sides. Japanese casualties were estimated at between 600 and 800 dead, with hundreds more wounded who were carried back through the jungle to Japanese-held territory. Many of the wounded would die from their injuries in the days and weeks that followed, lacking adequate medical facilities and supplies. Marine casualties for the 2 nights of fighting totaled 103, including 47 dead and 56 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. These numbers represented roughly 12% of the effective strength that had defended the ridge. For a military unit, 12% casualties in 2 days of fighting constitutes heavy losses, the kind of attrition that can break unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. But the 1st Raider Battalion did not break. On September 15th, the day after the second night's fighting ended, the raiders were still occupying defensive positions, still capable of offensive operations if ordered. They had absorbed casualties that would have rendered many units combat ineffective and remained a functional fighting force. This was the physical proof that contradicted Japanese assessments of American staying power. The defense of Edson's Ridge had immediate strategic consequences. Kawaguchi's defeat meant the Japanese had committed their best available troops to retaking Henderson Field, and failed. The airfield remained in American hands. Aircraft operating from Henderson continued to attack Japanese ships, attempting to resupply their airfield forces on Guadalcanal, maintaining the supply crisis that would ultimately doom the Japanese garrison. Japanese command recognized the severity of the defeat. Kawaguchi was relieved of command, replaced by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayakutake, who arrived on Guadalcanal in early October, with additional troops and orders to succeed where Kawaguchi had failed. But the pattern established at Bloody Ridge would repeat itself in subsequent battles. Japanese forces would attack with determination and courage. American forces, including but not limited to the raiders, would hold defensive positions through sustained combat that tested endurance and will. The raiders themselves continued fighting on Guadalcanal until December 1942, conducting patrols, defending positions, and participating in operations to expand the American perimeter around Henderson Field. They took additional casualties during these months, losing men to combat, disease, and simple exhaustion. Malaria infected nearly every man in the battalion at some point. Dysentery was endemic. Fungal infections rotted uniforms and equipment. The tropical environment was as much an enemy as Japanese forces. In December, the 1st Raider Battalion was withdrawn from Guadalcanal and sent to Australia for rest and reconstitution. They had been in continuous combat or combat-ready status for 4 months. They had participated in the Tulagi landing, the Tasimboko raid, the defense of Bloody Ridge, and dozens of smaller actions. They had demonstrated that American forces could sustain extended operations under conditions that Japanese planners had assumed would break them. Lieutenant Colonel Edson received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the defense of the ridge. The citation specifically noted his courage under fire and his ability to maintain unit cohesion during critical moments when the defensive line was threatened with breakthrough. Multiple other raiders received Navy crosses, silver stars, and other decorations recognizing individual acts of heroism during the 2 nights of fighting. But the real legacy of Bloody Ridge was not in the medals awarded or the casualties inflicted. It was in the demonstration that Japanese assessments of American fighting qualities were fundamentally wrong. The raiders had proven they could hold terrain under sustained assault. They had proven they could absorb casualties and continue fighting. They had proven that their apparent lack of conventional discipline masked a different kind of discipline, one based on internalized standards rather than external enforcement. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal continued fighting until February 1943, when the last organized units were evacuated from the island. During those months, American forces expanded their perimeter, brought in additional troops and supplies, and gradually wore down Japanese resistance through attrition and isolation. The pattern established at Bloody Ridge repeated across the island. Japanese forces would attack, American forces would hold, and the cumulative effect of these tactical stalemates was strategic defeat for Japan. Japanese military intelligence began reassessing American fighting capabilities after Guadalcanal. Reports from survivors of Kawaguchi's brigade and from other units engaged on the island painted a picture that contradicted pre-war assumptions. American forces were not breaking under pressure. They were not retreating when faced with determined attack. They were holding positions, absorbing casualties, and maintaining organized resistance even under conditions of extreme hardship. These reassessments circulated through Japanese military command structures slowly and incompletely. Institutional resistance to revising fundamental assumptions about enemy capabilities is common in military organizations, particularly when those assumptions are tied to cultural beliefs about relative fighting spirit and moral superiority. Accepting that American forces could match Japanese endurance meant accepting that material advantages might prove decisive, that industrial capacity might matter more than warrior ethos. Some Japanese officers drew the correct conclusions. They recognized that American forces had staying power equivalent to or exceeding Japanese forces, that American logistics and supply systems allowed sustained operations that Japanese forces could not match, that technological advantages in areas like radio communication and close air support multiplied the effectiveness of American ground units. These officers argued for tactical adjustments, for defensive strategies that conserved Japanese strength rather than expending it in frontal assaults against prepared positions. But these voices were minority opinions within a command structure that remained committed to offensive operations and decisive battle. The doctrine of attacking regardless of casualties, of accepting heavy losses to achieve breakthrough, remained dominant through 1943 and into 1944. Japanese forces continued launching attacks similar to those that had failed at Bloody Ridge, achieving similar results. Heavy casualties, tactical failure, strategic attrition. The cost of these repeated failures was cumulative and ultimately catastrophic. Japan entered the Pacific War with approximately 200,000 trained infantry in its army and naval landing forces. These were professional soldiers, men who had completed years of training and often had combat experience from China. Replacing them required time, resources, and training infrastructure that Japan did not have in sufficient quantity. Every battalion destroyed in failed attacks on Guadalcanal was a battalion that could not be used to defend subsequent islands. Every experienced soldier killed attacking American positions was replaced by a recruit with minimal training who would be less effective in combat. The mathematical reality of attrition warfare became increasingly obvious as the war progressed. Japan was losing its best troops in battles that achieved nothing except buying time. The Marine Raiders, meanwhile, evolved and expanded. The success of the 1st Raider Battalion led to formation of additional Raider battalions, eventually constituting 4 battalions organized into 2 Raider regiments. These units conducted operations across the Pacific, participating in campaigns from New Georgia to Bougainville to Guam. They maintained their emphasis on aggressive tactics, small unit operations, and sustained combat effectiveness. In February 1944, the Raider battalions were disbanded, and their personnel distributed to regular Marine infantry regiments. This decision reflected a judgment by Marine Corps leadership that the entire Marine Corps should operate at Raider standards. that the skills and tactics developed by the raiders should become standard rather than specialized. Every Marine would be trained to operate independently, to show initiative, to sustain operations under difficult conditions. The raiders had demonstrated what was possible. Now that capability would be institutionalized across the force. The men who had defended Bloody Ridge scattered to other units, carrying with them the knowledge that they had held critical terrain against an enemy who was supposed to break them. Some would survive the war, many would not. Marine infantry casualties in the Pacific were approximately 38%, meaning more than 1 in 3 Marines who served in combat units would be killed or wounded before the war ended. The raiders, because they were consistently used in difficult operations, suffered higher casualty rates than average. Robert Leckie survived Guadalcanal and subsequent campaigns, was wounded on Peleliu, and later wrote multiple books about his experiences. His memoir, Helmet for My Pillow, provided a ground-level view of what it meant to be an infantryman in the Pacific, the daily reality of heat, disease, fear, and sudden violence that characterized island warfare. His account confirmed what official records documented, that the men who fought there endured conditions that tested human limits and emerged not broken, but hardened. The irony at the heart of this story is that both sides were partially correct in their assessments and completely wrong in their conclusions. The Japanese were correct that American society was individualistic, that American soldiers expected better living conditions than Japanese troops, that American military culture did not emphasize collective sacrifice to the degree Japanese culture did. But they were wrong to conclude that these characteristics would manifest as military weakness. The Marine raiders were indeed undisciplined by Japanese standards. They did not conform to rigid hierarchies. They did improvise and adapt rather than following predetermined plans, regardless of circumstances. They did emphasize individual initiative over collective conformity. But these characteristics were strengths, not weaknesses. They were the product of deliberate training meant to produce soldiers who could function independently when communications failed, when officers were killed, when circumstances demanded immediate action without waiting for orders. The cultural gap in understanding discipline proved decisive. Japanese forces possessed discipline defined as willingness to die on command. This was genuine courage, worthy of respect, but it was not sufficient to overcome material disadvantages and tactical inflexibility. American forces possessed discipline defined as internalized capability to perform difficult tasks without external enforcement. This was equally genuine, equally demanding, and ultimately more sustainable over extended operations. The defense of Bloody Ridge demonstrated these principles in their starkest form. 840 men held a position for 2 nights against 3,000 attackers who were willing to die to take that position. They held not because they were superior individual warriors, but because their training had prepared them to function as a cohesive unit under extreme stress, because their logistics system kept them supplied with ammunition, because their command structure remained coherent even when officers were killed or wounded, because their doctrine emphasized sustainability over dramatic gestures. The Japanese forces attacking that ridge were not inferior soldiers. They demonstrated remarkable courage and endurance. They attacked repeatedly despite heavy casualties. They fought in close combat with determination that bordered on fanaticism, but courage and determination were not sufficient. Superior firepower, better logistics, and doctrine that emphasized conservation of force proved more important than willingness to accept casualties. This pattern would repeat itself across the Pacific for the next 3 years. Japanese forces would attack prepared American positions, accept heavy casualties, and achieve nothing except buying time. American forces would hold those positions, absorb lesser casualties, and gradually expand their control over strategic territory. The cumulative effect was Japanese defeat through attrition, through the simple mathematics of replacing losses faster than the enemy could replace his. The men who fought on Bloody Ridge in September 1942 could not see this larger pattern. They knew only that they had to hold the ridge, that Henderson Field behind them was essential, that failing to hold meant failing in their mission. They held because they had been trained to hold, because they trusted their officers, because they trusted each other, because surrendering ground without orders was not acceptable, regardless of how tired or scared or outnumbered they felt. The Japanese soldiers attacking that ridge could not see the larger pattern either. They knew only that they had been ordered to take the ridge, that taking it required breaking through American positions, that their duty demanded they continue attacking until they succeeded or died trying. They attacked because they had been trained to attack, because their culture had instilled values that made retreat shameful, because their officers led from the front and died alongside them. Both groups of men were trapped in circumstances that demanded more than human beings should reasonably be expected to give. Both responded with courage that deserves recognition, regardless of which side they fought for. The difference in outcomes came not from differences in individual courage, but from differences in the systems that trained, equipped, supplied, and commanded them. The legacy of Bloody Ridge extends beyond the immediate tactical victory or the strategic retention of Henderson Field. It demonstrated that American forces could sustain extended combat and operations under conditions previously considered impossible, that doctrine emphasizing flexibility and adaptation could match or exceed doctrine emphasizing rigid determination, that industrial capacity translated into military capability in ways that fighting spirit alone could not overcome. The Japanese called the Marine raiders undisciplined. Then, those raiders held Guadalcanal for 4 months straight, fighting in conditions that killed more men through disease than enemy action, maintaining combat effectiveness while losing 1 in 3 men to various causes, proving that their apparent lack of discipline masked capabilities that conventional military forces struggled to match. That is the final irony, that what looked like weakness was strength, that what appeared undisciplined was a different kind of discipline, that underestimating your enemy based on surface characteristics rather than actual capabilities is a mistake that costs battles, campaigns, and ultimately wars. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.